They said my mom would never be worthy. At 22, she crossed the world, chasing love, chasing a life she wanted with my dad. But when she arrived at my grandma's house, the welcome was anything but warm. "You'll never be enough for him," my grandma said, eyes sharp, voice ice. "I won't let him live under my roof while you're here." It wasn't just words, it was a challenge, a statement of dominance. And my mom, she didn't argue. She didn't cry. She smiled faintly, packed her resolve, and left. My dad and mom moved out to a nearly built shed, a shell, cold walls and the smell of unfinished wood, but it was theirs. It was freedom. They built a home there, one nail at a time, one brick at a time, carving a life from nothing. And soon they had me, an innocent witness to a subtle, silent war that would unfold over decades. Life began ordinary. My mom had a quiet strength my grandma could never see, never acknowledge. But my grandma's scrutiny didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. From the very beginning, every choice, every small act of independence was met with criticism. The first target was my brother, left-handed. In my grandma's eyes, that wasn't just unusual, it was a curse. "That isn't my grandchild," she said. "Your mother, she cheated. She's a slut." Sharp words thrown like knives, aimed at someone too young to defend themselves. But my mom didn't respond with anger. She responded with subtlety. She knew confrontation would escalate, but patience could be a weapon. She started with little things, small items disappearing when my grandma visited, the salt, a remote, a small book. Nothing catastrophic, nothing confrontational, nothing traceable. She would let my grandma notice, panic, search, and inevitably buy replacements. Then, just as casually, my mom would return the items, acting as if nothing had ever happened. The chaos she left behind was quiet but relentless. My grandma, once controlling and proud, began to doubt herself, questioning her memory, her sanity. Every day she would misplace something. Every day she would fret, fume, panic. And every day my mom remained calm, collected, untouchable, watching, observing, guiding the storm she created. It wasn't about revenge and anger. It was about equilibrium. My mom understood something my grandma never would. Authority doesn't scream. It whispers. It nudges. It controls without confrontation. And slowly, my grandma began to lose her grip on the chaos she once controlled. I watched this unfold as a child, fascinated. My mom, with her quiet smiles and invisible manipulations, was orchestrating the impossible. She was reclaiming dignity and sanity through subtlety, humor, and intelligence. And yet, no one outside our home would notice. To the world, nothing was happening. But inside, every stolen remote, every vanished salt shaker was a victory, a calculated move in a long game that would end only when my grandma had no leverage left. And so the stage was set, the characters defined, the tension mounting. My mom had crossed oceans to start a life, and now she was quietly teaching an impossible lesson, one misplaced item at a time. After the first few months, it became clear my grandma was not just disapproving, she was relentless. Every visit my mom made was a minefield of judgment. A misplaced word, a slight misstep in the kitchen, even a polite smile could trigger a tirade. And yet, my mom never raised her voice. She never escalated. She simply observed, smiled faintly, and allowed her quiet intelligence to set the rules of engagement. It started small, things going missing, items I'd been told to keep safe disappearing mysteriously. The salt shaker from the table, the TV remote, a small decorative figurine. Always minor, always plausible. My grandma would search frantically, curse under her breath, buy replacements. And every time, my mom would calmly return the item at just the right moment, casually placing it back as if nothing had ever happened. I remember one evening clearly. Grandma was tearing apart the living room, checking drawers and cupboards for a missing sugar container. My mom walked in, carrying a stack of laundry, noticed the chaos, and simply asked, "Did you find what you were looking for?" Grandma froze, mouth open. My mom smiled, lifted the sugar container from behind the teapot, and set it gently on the counter. "Oh, I must have missed it," she said softly. And just like that, the storm dissipated. Except it hadn't. My grandma started questioning her own memory. How could she constantly misplace things? Why did items appear in impossible places? My mom never commented. She never laughed. She never gloated.
And yet, slowly, the tension began to shift. My grandma, once commanding and controlling, started doubting herself. Every small disappearance was calculated, nothing impulsive, nothing random. My mom observed patterns, what items my grandma valued, what triggered her anxiety, what moments she expected total control. Then she used those observations to create tiny disruptions, enough to make her feel unsettled, but never so much that anyone else would notice. Meanwhile, life in our little home continued. My mom and dad raised us with stability and laughter, even as the undercurrent of tension ran just beneath the surface with my grandma. To outsiders, our family seemed perfectly normal, but at home, the air was electric with quiet, strategic conflict. I started noticing my mom's subtle cues as a child, how she'd pause before opening a drawer, how she'd glance at a corner and smirk subtly, almost imperceptibly. She was always 2 steps ahead, knowing exactly what my grandma expected and planning 3 moves beyond it. I didn't understand the full scope then, but I felt it. The tension, the invisible chess match, the invisible victories that played out without words. And by the time I was old enough to follow the logic, I realized my mom had created an entire system, one that maintained her dignity, amused her intelligence, and wore down my grandma's arrogance without anyone noticing. She wasn't angry, she wasn't vindictive, she was clever, patient, and unstoppable. The most impressive part was how subtle it all was. Nothing destructive, nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just tiny manipulations that built psychological pressure over time. My grandma, once untouchable in her authority, now faced invisible frustrations daily. Every missing remote, every vanished salt shaker, every item that mysteriously reappeared after she had replaced it chipped away at her composure. And as the months passed, the tension grew. My mom didn't need to confront her. She didn't need to argue or explain. She simply let the quiet frustration accumulate. Every visit, every interaction, every small disappearance nudged my grandma closer to the edge of her own patience.
What my grandma didn't realize, and what made this strategy so brilliant, was that my mom's actions were never random. Every misplacement, every disappearance, every subtle return of objects was deliberate. They were tiny strokes in a masterpiece of psychological revenge. And yet, to everyone else, it was invisible, just the ebb and flow of family life. I began documenting it in my mind. Every glance, every sigh, every whispered complaint was part of a bigger picture. My mom teaching a lesson in patience, intelligence, and control. She had entered my grandma's house as the outsider, the young woman who would never be enough, and yet over time, she became the one shaping the rules of engagement, controlling outcomes, and demonstrating that dignity and composure are more powerful than anger or authority. By the time my mom became a mother herself, raising us, my brother and me, the pattern had solidified. My grandma was still sharp, still vocal, still critical, but now she lived in a world where small things disappeared. Tension simmered silently, and my mom's quiet victories were everywhere. It was a subtle, long-term revenge, one that no shouting match or confrontation could achieve. And in those quiet, formative years, I learned something important. Intelligence, patience, and subtlety can accomplish what rage and force never could. You don't need to scream to win. You don't need to attack to dominate. Sometimes, the calm, persistent hand shapes the outcome more than the loudest voice in the room. By the end of part 2, the stage was fully set. The psychological tension had escalated. The chessboard was in play, with my mom always 2 moves ahead, my grandma unknowingly trapped in a slow burn of subtle frustration. By the time I was a teenager, the quiet tension my mom had been cultivating over years had begun to bear its full effect. My grandma, once sharp, confident, and intimidating, had started to wobble in ways that were almost imperceptible to anyone outside the household, but impossible to miss for those living inside it. It started with small frustrations, little cracks in her composure. She'd reach for the TV remote, and it would be gone. She'd put down the salt, and it vanished. My mom never laughed, never commented. She simply observed,
occasionally returning the items after my grandma had replaced them with a faint, knowing smile. Each time my grandma replaced something, she was reminded, subtly, that control could slip through her fingers. The pattern accelerated when my grandma tried to assert dominance in ways that affected the children, my brother and me. My brother was left-handed, something she had fixated on as a curse. "That isn't my grandchild," she would say, hurling accusations of infidelity toward my mum. But now, with the constant, invisible disruptions my mum had orchestrated, even her authority over us started to feel shaky. I remember one afternoon clearly. Grandma was in the kitchen, searching frantically for the sugar bowl she was sure she had placed on the counter. My mum was quietly folding laundry in the next room. "Have you checked behind the teapot?" she asked, as if it were a casual suggestion. Grandma froze, scowled, and opened the cabinet to find the sugar bowl sitting neatly. She turned, glaring, but my mum's calm expression was unyielding. "I must have overlooked it," she said softly, as if nothing had happened. It was humiliating, not in an obvious way, but in a slow, grinding psychological manner. The authority my grandma once wielded effortlessly over our home now came with a cost. Constant doubt, small failures, the creeping suspicion that she was losing control. My mom never rushed, never forced the issue. She let the pressure build organically, like water eroding stone. Even other family members began to notice. Small comments slipped from my parents, from us kids. "Mom seems different when Grandma visits," my dad would say, almost hesitantly. They didn't know the full game. They didn't need to. The effect was already visible. My grandma's confidence faltered in ways she didn't understand. The brilliance of my mom's strategy was how personal it felt to my grandma while remaining invisible to the world. No one would ever accuse my mom of maliciousness, of revenge, or of any wrongdoing. She was simply living her life, raising her children, keeping the house in order. And yet the subtle shifts in control, the small disappearances, the calm interruptions of my grandma's authority, these were invisible weapons that left my grandma questioning her memory, her competence, even her grip on reality. I recall a day when my grandma accused my mom of stealing something again. My mom's response? A faint shrug. "I haven't touched it," with a faint smile. Grandma stormed around, fuming, checking every surface. Hours later, the item was discovered exactly where my mom had hidden it, as if by accident. By the time it returned to its place, my grandma had spent her energy, her dignity, and her authority trying to reclaim what she thought was lost. And that was the point. My mom wasn't angry. She wasn't taking revenge in the way most people imagine. She was teaching a lesson. The illusion of control is fragile, and arrogance paired with cruelty can be dismantled quietly, without confrontation, without noise. By now, the pattern was fully internalized for the children in the house. We observed, learned, and even found ourselves quietly rooting for my mom's subtle victories. We understood the power of patience, of subtle intelligence, of letting someone's ego unravel through their own actions rather than your interference. Grandma's breakdown wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. Every missing remote, every vanished salt shaker, every quietly returned item chipped away at her composure. Every time she tried to assert dominance, she encountered a roadblock that was invisible, untraceable, and relentless. I remember sitting at the dinner table one evening, watching my mum casually answer a question from my dad while my grandma, frustrated, rummaged through drawers looking for her glasses that had mysteriously disappeared. She finally found them on top of the ridge where my mum had placed them hours before. My grandma's face went pale, her eyes wide, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of tears. It was the culmination of years of patient, deliberate action. Not cruelty, not malice, but psychological mastery. My mum had turned every insult, every accusation, every attempt at humiliation into an opportunity to demonstrate composure, intelligence, and unshakable calm.
By the end of part 3, the shift was undeniable. Grandma, once untouchable, was now caught in a slow-burn humiliation, trapped by her own misjudgments and my mum's subtle strategy. She still tried, still argued, still asserted herself, but every attempt was met with calm, invisible resistance. The slow, intelligent planning my mum had started years ago had come to fruition. After years of quiet victories, my mom didn't rush or celebrate. She never gloated. That was the brilliance of it. Her triumphs weren't loud. They were invisible, almost imperceptible. To the outside world, everything was normal. To my grandma, life had become a maze where the rules were invisible, yet every wrong turn carried consequences she didn't understand. My mom often retreated into her own quiet space after visits, not out of fear or shame, but to reflect, observe, and plan her next subtle move. She treated each interaction like a chess game, always thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead. She studied patterns, noted weaknesses, and allowed small disruptions to build tension slowly. She never needed to argue or prove a point. She let the chaos of lost items, misplaced objects, and quiet frustrations do the talking. I watched her in these moments, silently marveling. She would sit, often folding laundry or reading, calm, composed, almost meditative, while my grandma's frustrations built in the background. She wasn't passive. She was strategic, patient, and deliberate. Every silence was measured, every action calculated. This phase of the subtle war wasn't about immediate results. It was about psychological pressure, the slow accumulation of doubt, the erosion of false authority. Grandma would fume, complain, and search, but my mom remained serene. Items returned mysteriously, missing things appeared when least expected, and each small victory reinforced my mom's invisible control over the environment. What made it so effective was its consistency. Over time, even minor disruptions were enough to make my grandma second-guess herself. "Did I put this there?" she'd mutter, scouring the room for something that had been deliberately moved. My mom's presence was calm, neutral, reassuring, and that only amplified the frustration. Here was the one she sought to dominate, completely unshaken, almost untouchable. I began noticing a pattern as a child. The more my grandma tried to assert dominance, the more subtle disruptions followed. My mom never instigated. They were always responses, strategic and precise, designed to maintain psychological leverage. She allowed my grandma to feel in control, only to slowly dismantle that sense from the inside. This wasn't vindictiveness, it was mastery of patience. Over time, my grandma's confidence waned. She questioned herself, her memory, her ability to assert authority. The constant tension, the repeated failures over small tasks began to wear her down in ways words never could. Meanwhile, life outside this quiet war continued. My mom raised her children with stability, humor, and love. We were witnesses, and even unwitting participants in this psychological game. The lessons were subtle but profound. Intelligence, patience, and calm observation often win where rage, criticism, or aggression fail. She didn't rush, she didn't demand acknowledgement. She allowed my grandma's frustration and confusion to simmer, teaching a lesson in restraint and control. And in that patience, she found satisfaction. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady and enduring. By the end of this phase, my mom had built an unassailable position, a home ruled not just by authority alone, but by careful, intelligent, and lawful psychological influence. Every misplaced object, every quiet intervention, every subtle nudge had contributed to a slow burn victory. I realized then that revenge doesn't need to be explosive. It doesn't need to be public. It can be deliberate, calm, patient, and ultimately far more satisfying. My mom's quiet genius was evident in every interaction, every subtle correction of behavior, every invisible adjustment that left my grandma questioning herself without realizing why. And slowly, over months and years, the balance shifted.
Grandma, once the unquestioned authority, now faced a world where her influence was imperfect, her control undermined by subtlety and patience. She had become, in a sense, a participant in her own undoing. The calm after every incident was deliberate. Silence, observation, and reflection were tools my mum wielded with precision. Nothing was wasted. Every action, every pause, every interaction was purposeful. She was the architect of an invisible system where control, patience, and subtlety were the ultimate weapons. By the time I was old enough to understand, the strategy was clear. Patience beats force, observation beats anger, and subtlety beats aggression. And my mom had demonstrated this truth in ways that were invisible to anyone outside the household, but unmistakable to those living within it. By the time my grandma had reached what she considered her peak of control, my mom was ready to apply the full weight of her quiet strategy. Years of careful observation, subtle manipulations, and psychological nudges had built an invisible system in which every action my grandma took could be anticipated, countered, or rendered irrelevant. It began with escalation, though nothing dramatic to an outsider. Small objects continued to vanish, but now their disappearance was coupled with deliberate timing to maximize confusion. Items were placed back only after my grandma had purchased replacements or complained vocally, reinforcing the subtle erosion of her authority. Every moment she exerted control, every accusation she leveled became a trigger for her own growing frustration. One afternoon, my grandma accused my mom of intentionally hiding her silverware. My mom's response was effortless calm. She lifted a single fork from behind the salt cellar, set it on the counter, and said, "I haven't touched this. Have you looked carefully?" My grandma froze, realizing she had checked that spot multiple times. That tiny victory, one small fork, was emblematic of a larger methodical dismantling of her ego. My mom never needed to argue. She didn't need to scream, to confront, or manipulate overtly. Her strategy relied on legal, harmless, and repeatable actions, moving things, subtle placement, silent observation, and impeccable timing. Each small disruption amplified the tension without leaving any trace of wrongdoing. The psychological consequences for my grandma were profound. She began to doubt her memory, second-guess her judgments, and ultimately stopped asserting authority. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, grew hesitant. Every visit she made, she carried the invisible weight of expectation and subtle disappointment, though she could never articulate why.
Family gatherings amplified the effect. Where once my grandma had dominated conversations and household dynamics, she now played a quieter role. She tried to regain control only to find herself thwarted in small, almost invisible ways. Items went missing, routines were subtly altered, and each failure chipped away at the confidence she had once wielded effortlessly. Meanwhile, my mom maintained a calm and composed exterior. She never gloating, never boasting, never explaining. To the casual observer, she was simply a mother, a wife, a responsible adult managing a household. But within this quiet framework, she had achieved complete mastery. Every act of authority my grandma attempted was neutralized or rendered moot. Every insult, every criticism, every attempt to dominate became another data point in my mom's long-term strategic plan. By the end of the first year of deliberate execution, my grandma's behavior had shifted entirely. She no longer imposed on my family, no longer attempted to assert dominance, and no longer criticized our choices with the same confidence. Instead, she lived in a constant state of subtle uncertainty, her authority quietly dismantled by patience, intelligence, and psychological precision. Even the small victories, returning a misplaced remote, placing salt behind a cabinet, moving a book, had cumulative impact. They reinforced the subtle message: control is temporary, arrogance has limits, and patience can outlast anger. My mom's revenge was complete not with confrontation, but with sustained, invisible strategy that left my grandma's ego quietly, irrevocably shaken. The consequences rippled beyond the immediate household. Extended family noticed the shift in dynamics. Where once my grandma had dominated every discussion, she now deferred. Where she had issued ultimatums, she now hesitated. And yet, to anyone outside our home, it looked ordinary. Nothing had been stolen, nothing illegal had been done, and nothing could be pinned on my mom as revenge or spite. The brilliance of the approach was this. Every action was legal, harmless, and emotionally precise. Nothing could be challenged, nothing could be misinterpreted. The strategy was subtle, slow, intelligent, and unstoppable. By letting the frustration build naturally, my mom ensured that the punishment was psychological, cumulative, and long-lasting. By the time I was in my late teens, I could see the final phase of the plan unfolding. My grandma had gradually withdrawn from all interactions with our household. Conversations were minimal, visits were rare, and the power she once exercised so confidently had evaporated entirely. My mom's patience, calm, and intelligence had quietly orchestrated a scenario where respect was restored on her terms, not my grandma's. In these quiet victories, there was a deeper lesson. Revenge doesn't need chaos or drama. It doesn't need to be loud or public. It can be slow, deliberate, invisible, and emotionally devastating in the most precise way. And it works best when the person executing it remains calm, patient, and unshakable, letting the consequences fall naturally. By the end of Part 5, the balance had shifted completely. My mom's quiet, strategic actions had achieved what anger, shouting, or confrontation never could. Grandma's authority was dismantled without confrontation. Her arrogance had been eroded without humiliation in front of the world. The household was stable, our family united, and the lesson, careful intelligence, patience, and strategy had been taught quietly but unmistakably. After years of quiet, deliberate action, the tension that had once defined our home slowly faded. My grandma, who had once ruled every corner with sharp words and unwavering authority, had retreated into silence. She no longer issued ultimatums, no longer questioned my mom's decisions, no longer attempted to assert dominance. Instead, she lived in a constant state of subtle uncertainty, her authority quietly dismantled by patience, intelligence, and psychological precision. I watched her quietly, noting the transformation. She was still present, but her confidence had waned. Her arrogance, her attempts to dominate, her constant criticism, they had all lost power. And yet there was no public spectacle, no dramatic reveal, no vindictive flourish. Everything had been accomplished with calm precision, measured in years, not hours. My mom, meanwhile, remained serene. She never gloated, never explained, never boasted. She continued to raise our children, manage our household, and live her life with the same quiet grace that had defined her strategy from the beginning. And in that quiet, I could see the true depth of her satisfaction. It wasn't loud or performative. It wasn't revenge for show. It was justice executed with intelligence and patience. Reflecting back, I realized the full scope of what she had achieved. She had transformed an oppressive environment into a place of calm and stability. She had reclaimed authority not by force, but by subtle mastery. And in doing so, she taught lessons that no lecture or argument ever could. Patience can outlast arrogance, intelligence can outmaneuver cruelty, and calm, deliberate action can achieve results that rage and confrontation never will. The lessons extended beyond family dynamics. They taught resilience, strategy, and emotional intelligence, how to respond to hostility, not with anger, but with measured, intelligent action. I saw it not just as revenge, but as a profound demonstration of personal power and dignity. Over time, the household became a place of peace. My mom and dad continued their life together, raising us with stability, love, and humor. Grandma's influence had diminished, and though she remained part of our lives, the psychological imbalance she once maintained was gone. She had been taught, quietly but decisively, that control comes with responsibility, and those who underestimate patience, intelligence, and subtlety will inevitably face consequences.
And in that calm, measured victory, my mom found something deeper than triumph,
freedom. Freedom from constant criticism, from relentless judgment, from the invisible chains of someone else's arrogance. And watching her navigate that freedom, I learned one of life's most important truths. The most satisfying victories are not loud or flashy. They are patient, deliberate, and carried out with integrity. For anyone watching this story, remember this: revenge doesn't require chaos. True mastery lies in patience, observation, and subtle, intelligent action. Let your strategy unfold naturally. Let consequences speak for themselves, and let silence carry the weight of your power. As I sit here reflecting on the years, I can only smile at my mum's quiet brilliance. She didn't need to confront, yell, or fight. She simply lived her life, subtly correcting injustices and letting the natural consequences of her intelligence and patience play out. And that, in the end, was more satisfying than anything loud or dramatic could ever be. If you stayed with me through this story, know there are countless others like it, real, emotional, and intense. Stories of quiet revenge, patient strategy, and subtle justice. If you want to hear more, stay with Payback Ties, where the calm often speaks louder than the storm.